Have you ever wondered what a dog might be guarding when no one's watching? In the sleepy town of Willow Creek, as snow fell like forgotten memories, a golden retriever sat alone by a storm drain every single morning. His eyes held a story no one dared to ask about, until one day someone finally did. And what they discovered beneath that grate wasn't just a secret, it was a miracle waiting to be found. Willow Creek was the kind of town that seemed painted by nostalgia. Nestled at the base of the Colorado Rockies, it slumbered beneath thick blankets of snow for nearly 5 months a year. In late February, when the white crust hardened into a brittle glaze and the trees looked like skeletal sketches of their summer selves, the mornings were often as silent as prayer. The only sound came from the scraping of snow shovels, the occasional bark, or the low rumble of a delivery truck, too stubborn to admit defeat to the icy roads. On the corner, where Pine Street and Bellflower Avenue met near the heart of Willow Creek's old district, there sat a storm drain made of aging iron. Rust framed its edges like the tired eyelids of someone who had seen too much, and in front of it, almost without fail, sat a golden retriever named Max. Max was no one's dog, and yet, in a strange and solemn way, he belonged to everyone. He was large even for a golden. His coat, once the color of ripe wheat, was matted and tangled from seasons of wandering. He moved with the cautious grace of an animal that had learned to be gentle in a world that wasn't. His left ear drooped slightly, as if perpetually listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. No one knew exactly where Max had come from. Some said he'd been abandoned on the edge of town 3 winters ago. Others believed he had belonged to an old hunter who had passed away up in the cabins by the lake. The truth had melted into myth, and Max never offered his side of the story. Each day at sunrise, Max would trot down Pine Street, his breath puffing in clouds, paws leaving faint impressions on the snow, until he reached the drain. There he would sit for hours, his golden body, a soft contrast to the harsh white landscape. His gaze never wavered. He stared into the slats of that drain with the focus of a sentinel. Even after the heaviest snowfalls, he would return, sometimes digging away at the snow until the grate was exposed again. People talked, of course. Willow Creek was small. Old men at the barber shop and women at the church fundraiser speculated over coffee and cinnamon rolls. He's guarding something, one said. Maybe he lost a litter there. Or he's waiting for someone, said another. But none dared disturb him. Something about the quiet reverence of his vigil made people pause, made them respect the stillness he brought with him. Living just down the street from the crossroads was Claire Whitmore, a woman of 68, with a spine still straight, despite the years, and a pair of eyes that had forgotten how to twinkle after her husband Harold passed away. Claire lived alone in a red brick house with a narrow porch and green shutters that had long faded into gray. She wore her silver hair in a tidy bun and always had flour somewhere on her sweater sleeves. From the bakery, she still ran a small place called the Buttered Crumb, known more for its blueberry muffins than its profitability. Claire was not unkind, but solitude had sculpted her into a woman of few words and efficient movements. She greeted neighbors with a nod and helped shovel the sidewalk without being asked, but rarely lingered for conversation. Harold's sudden death from a heart attack 5 years ago had broken something delicate in her. Since then, she lived in a careful balance of routine and silence. But Claire had noticed Max. He started appearing in front of her house every morning that winter, always before she opened the bakery. He never barked, never whined, never begged. He simply sat tail tucked politely, as though waiting for something unspoken to pass between them. Some mornings, Claire would toss him a crust of bread, and he would accept it with a slow wag of his tail before trotting off. What intrigued Claire was not just his presence, but his absence of need. He didn't look hungry, though he was lean. He didn't follow anyone or try to sneak into homes. He just seemed purposeful. And that storm drain. Always the storm drain. One morning, after a long night of snow, Claire found herself standing at her window with a cup of black coffee in her hands, watching Max dig determinedly at the drift that had covered the grate. His shoulders hunched his paws, pushing snow aside with a kind of mournful urgency. She felt a strange twist in her chest, something between admiration and ache. She opened her door and called softly Max. The dog paws lifted his head ears, flicking back at the sound of his name, a name she had given him weeks ago, though he had never confirmed it was his. He trotted to her tail, swinging low. She offered him the last of a warm biscuit, which he took gently, then to her mild surprise turned and walked back to the drain. Claire followed him this time. Only a few steps, just enough to see what he would do. Max lay down beside the great biscuit untouched in the snow beside him, and he waited. "What are you watching, old boy?" she murmured. He didn't move, only blinked once slowly, as though trying to tell her something without scaring it away. That day Claire opened the bakery a little late. By noon, the town square was awake with slow-moving footsteps and the buzz of conversation at the post office. Children trudged by in puffy jackets, and older folks sipped cocoa from thermoses while watching the snow melt on benches. Max stayed at his post unmoved. By evening, Claire walked past again closing shop and found him still there, but the biscuit was gone. She looked at him, truly looked this time, and thought, "You're not just watching that drain, are you? You're waiting for something, or someone." She didn't know yet what it was, but she knew she'd be back tomorrow to find out. Morning in Willow Creek came slowly, as if the sun were reluctant to rise over the snow-covered roofs and sleepy trees. The clouds hung low and thick, casting the streets in a muted blue haze. Claire Whitmore stood behind the counter of the Buttered Crumb, her hands deep in dough, the sleeves of her cardigan dusted with flour like frost. Her bakery smelled of yeast and cinnamon, the kind of scent that wrapped around you like a woolen scarf. At precisely 7:05 a.m., she glanced out the frost-speckled window and, as expected, saw him, Max the golden dog, with the gaze of a monk sitting by the iron storm drain. He looked as he always did, dignified, patient, almost carved out of stillness itself. Today, however, Claire had decided to do something different. The night before, she had stayed up later than usual, rolling out a batch of cheese swirls, her late husband Harold's favorite. The recipe was one of the few he'd helped her perfect before his passing. It felt oddly fitting to make them again, as though some old warmth was leaking back into her bones. Wrapping one in a piece of wax paper, she stepped outside into the brittle air. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she approached Max, who turned his head slightly but did not rise. His eyes were calm but alert, as if he recognized her soul long before he acknowledged her footsteps. Claire crouched slowly, her knees protesting, and extended the pastry toward him. "Try this, boy," she murmured. "I saved the best swirl for you." Max sniffed the bread, his nose twitching gently. Then, to Claire's surprise, he took it not. With the eager hunger of a stray, but with something more deliberate, he held it in his mouth, turned away, and trotted back to the storm drain. He didn't eat it. He simply placed the wrapped swirl beside the grate, nudged it closer with his paw, and lay down next to it, resuming his vigil. Claire blinked. She had expected him to devour it instantly, perhaps even beg for more, but he hadn't even tasted it. "You're feeding someone," she said aloud, though the idea sounded absurd. At that moment, a young voice startled her from behind. "He doesn't eat anything near people." She turned to see a boy, maybe 12 or 13, standing a few feet away. He was tall for his age, with a wiry frame hidden beneath a puffy red coat. His hair was the color of damp straw poking out from beneath a wool cap, and his boots looked like they belonged to someone with bigger feet. His face was pale but curious, his mouth pulled into a half-smirk, as if constantly caught between sarcasm and shyness. "I've seen him hide food before," the boy said. "He's like storing it. Like a squirrel." Claire tilted her head. "And who might you be, Jamie? Jamie Fletcher?" he said, brushing his mittened hands against his jeans. "My dad and I just moved here. He's the new manager at the sawmill." Claire remembered hearing about that. The mill had hired someone from Denver, a single father, if rumors were true. Jamie stepped closer to Max, but kept a respectful distance. "I come by most mornings. He's always here staring down there, like it's the entrance to another world." Claire studied Jamie for a moment. There was something brittle in the boy's posture, like a branch burdened with too much snow. She recognized that posture she had worn it herself after Harold died. "You live near?" she asked. "Over on Maple Street. Apartment above the garage. Dad works all the time. I walk here before school." Claire nodded. "Do you like pastries?" Jamie gave a shy grin. "Who doesn't?" "Well," she said, dusting off her hands. "We open at 8. You should stop by sometime." Jamie gave Max a final glance, then shrugged. "I will." As he walked away, Claire turned back to Max, who was still lying beside the swirl of cheese, staring into the grate like it might whisper back at any moment. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Claire closed her bakery and bundled up for the walk home. On her way, she passed by the storm drain again. Max was gone, but the swirl was gone too. Not eaten. Gone. There were no crumbs, no scraps, no torn wax paper. Just a faint paw print in the snow near the drain. Claire knelt peering into the slats. Nothing moved, but the darkness below seemed to pulse with a quiet secret. The next morning, she brought another swirl. Max was there waiting. This time, Jamie joined her. "I brought something too," the boy said, producing a half sandwich from his pocket. Turkey and mustard, not gourmet but edible. Max received both offerings with the same quiet dignity, placing them carefully beside the drain. For the next 3 days, the routine continued. Claire with her pastries, Jamie with his leftovers, Max with his silence. The food always disappeared by evening, but neither dog nor humans ever caught a glimpse of who or what was taking it. And Claire, who had spent 5 years trying not to care about anything new, found herself waking earlier each morning, baking a little more deliberately, and watching that storm drain with increasing fascination. The blizzard arrived with a ferocity Willow Creek hadn't seen in years. By nightfall, the town disappeared under a wall of white, the streets' abandoned windows shuttered and chimneys struggling against the bitter wind. Snow fell in heavy sheets, swallowing every familiar landmark until the entire world seemed nothing more than an endless ocean of cold. Claire Whitmore sat by the small hearth in her parlor, nursing a cup of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. Outside, the storm raged on. She couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. Max had not come by that morning. For the first time all winter, his usual silhouette had been missing from the bakery window. That absence echoed louder in her heart than she dared to admit. By dawn, the storm had passed, but what it left behind was a landscape buried in silence. The roads were impassable, blanketed by snowdrifts taller than fence posts. Claire layered herself in Harold's old army parka, its hem dragging against her boots, and stepped outside. The cold bit at her cheeks and turned her breath to fog. The world was still. Too still. She made her way through the snow-covered streets toward the crossroad, her footsteps deep and slow. As she turned the corner onto Bellflower Avenue, her eyes locked on a familiar golden figure. Max was there, but not sitting in his usual calm, statuesque way. He was frantic, his front paws red and raw, as he clawed desperately at the snow piled over the storm drain. His sides heaved with effort, and small whines broke from his throat with every exhausted breath. Max, Claire called, rushing forward as quickly as the snow allowed. The dog paused, turned his head toward her, and in his eyes she saw a rare thing: panic. Then, without hesitation, Max turned back to his desperate task, pawing harder. Before she could kneel beside him, a voice broke through the cold air, breathless and hoarse. "Is he okay?" Claire turned to see Jamie Fletcher sprinting down the street, his red puffer jacket open, despite the freezing cold, his boots half buried in snow. His cheeks were flushed from running his breath a white cloud. "He's been at this for hours." Jamie gasped as he reached her side. "I saw him from my window before dawn." Claire bent down and brushed the snow away from the grate. "Something's down there," she muttered. Jamie dropped to his knees beside her, peering through the rusted metal bars. His breath hitched. "Claire, look." She leaned over and at first saw nothing but darkness, but then 2 tiny glimmers of reflected light. Then another. And another. Huddled in the narrow shaft beneath the drain were 3 tiny puppies. Their coats were soaked and clumped with ice, their small bodies pressed tightly together. One let out the faintest, most pitiful whimper Claire had ever heard. "They're alive!" Jamie breathed, his young face pale under the weight of helplessness. Claire stood abruptly, her heart thundering. "We need to call for help. The fire department, they'll have the tools." "I'll go." Jamie spun on his heel and bolted toward the town square before she could stop him, his figure quickly swallowed by the snow-covered street. Claire turned back to Max, who had finally stopped digging. He sat beside the grate now, his body trembling from the cold, his eyes never leaving the dark opening. Claire knelt beside him, her gloved hand gently stroking his damp fur. "You've been trying to save them, haven't you?" she whispered. "All this time bringing food here? It wasn't for you." Minutes felt like hours before the faint wail of a siren broke through the morning air. A red fire truck slowly crawled down the ice-laden street tire chains, clinking over the frozen ground. Captain Roy Denner stepped out first, a broad man with a thick gray beard and a voice that seemed to vibrate the very air. His dark eyes were sharp despite his years, and he walked with the purposeful authority of someone used to saving lives. "Where's the trouble?" he asked, taking in the scene in one sweeping glance. "Down there," Claire pointed toward the grate. "3 puppies. They're freezing to death." Captain Denner crouched low, studying the situation. Behind him, his crew moved quickly. Caleb, a tall, freckle-faced young firefighter with clumsy enthusiasm, and Erin, a compact woman with a fiery mane of red hair and the calm efficiency of someone who never wasted emotion, prepared the rescue gear. Within minutes, the rusted grate was carefully lifted away. Steam rose as the warmth from underground met the icy air. Caleb shone a flashlight into the dark space below. "They're right there," he confirmed, voice tight. "We can get them." One by one, the puppies were lifted out, trembling and silent from cold. Claire took the smallest one into her arms, cradling it against her chest beneath her heavy coat. Its tiny heart fluttered weakly against her ribs. Jamie came running back just as the last puppy was rescued. His chest heaved, but relief flooded his young face when he saw the tiny creatures safe. Max, exhausted and shivering, walked slowly to the puppies, his nose gently nudging each one. His tail wagged faintly for the first time that morning. Captain Denner straightened his breath, a long cloud in the frigid air. "You've got a guardian angel watching over this town." "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, glancing down at Max. Claire felt tears sting her eyes. She held the small bundle closer and whispered to the Max, "You saved them, old boy. You really did." The storm had passed, but Willow Creek remained frozen in the aftermath. Snow blanketed the narrow streets like a thick, silent memory, and icicles hung from rooftops like nature's own warning signs. Despite the biting cold outside, warmth filled the small veterinary clinic tucked behind Main Street. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, but beneath it lingered something more comforting, the gentle, almost imperceptible hope that life, even fragile life, could endure. On a heated table by the clinic's old brick fireplace, 3 tiny puppies lay curled beneath layers of flannel blankets. Their fur was still damp, but slowly fluffing up into soft tufts of cream and honey. Their breaths came in uneven, shallow puffs, each rise and fall of their tiny chests, a battle against the cold that had nearly stolen them. Max lay nearby on the tiled floor, his golden coat dull, and tangled his large paws reddened and raw from his desperate digging. Though clearly exhausted, he refused to rest. His dark, expressive eyes never left the small lives he had fought to save, and every time one of the puppies stirred or whimpered, his ears flicked up in silent attention. Claire stood by the examination table, her hands clasped tightly together, shoulders drawn up against a worry she could neither quiet nor shake off. She had thought she'd seen enough hardship in her life, enough loss, but watching those tiny creatures fight for every breath unraveled something soft and aching in her chest. Jamie sat on a low wooden bench nearby, his elbows on his knees, fists pressed under his chin. His face was pale from the cold and the long night without sleep, but his wide eyes, shining with both fear and wonder, never left the tiny pups. Behind them, the door creaked open, and in stepped Dr. Martha Brenly, the town's only veterinarian. Martha was a stout woman in her late 50s, her sturdy frame softened by years of tending both animals and the people who loved them. Her hair, a stubborn mix of salt and pepper, was pinned back in a loose bun, and she wore thick glasses perched precariously on the bridge of her nose. Her voice was roughened by years of cold mornings and long nights spent nursing animals back from the brink, but it carried a calm, commanding steadiness that could quiet any room. Martha approached the table, listening carefully with her stethoscope against each fragile chest, her thick brows furrowed as she worked her lips pressed into a thoughtful line. Finally, she pulled back and looked to Claire and Jamie. "They're cold, but they're fighters," she announced. "Weak, but if they made it through the night, they've got a chance." Her eyes flicked toward Max, softening just slightly. "And it seems they've had the best guardian anyone could ask for." Max gave a low, almost inaudible sigh, his head resting back on his outstretched paws, though his eyes stayed wide open, fixed on the little ones. Martha turned to prepare a bottle of formula at the counter, her back to them, as she added, "It's going to take constant warmth and regular feeding every couple of hours. No guarantees, but with care, they'll pull through." Claire exhaled a breath. She didn't realize she'd been holding her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to gently touch the smallest pup. Its tiny body shivered under her warm fingers, but she could feel the faintest stubborn beat of life. At that moment, the door creaked open again, letting in a sharp gust of cold air, and a tall, broad-shouldered man with snow still dusting his dark hair. Patrick Fletcher. Jamie's father stepped inside. In his early 40s, Patrick wore his years heavily. His square jaw was shadowed with stubble, and his eyes held the weight of a man who had spent far too long bearing grief alone. His work jacket smelled faintly of sawdust and pine, and his hands were rough and scarred from years at the mill. Jamie Patrick said softly, his voice low and unsure. His eyes swept the room, landing first on the puppies, then on Max, and finally on his son. "I woke up, and you were gone. When I saw the storm—" He didn't finish the sentence. Jamie stood but didn't move toward his father. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his jacket, his eyes refusing to meet his father's directly. "I was helping," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Patrick swallowed hard, his shoulders sagging. There was a long pause before he crossed the room and placed a calloused hand gently on Jamie's shoulder. "You did good," he said simply. And for a moment, Jamie stood still, his thin shoulders rigid, before finally relaxing beneath his father's hand. That evening, as news of the rescue spread through the town, like a warm current under the frozen streets, people began to arrive at the small clinic. They came with old blankets, mason jars of soup, knitted scarves, and soft toys for the puppies. Mrs. Agnes Henley, the town's oldest resident at nearly 92, hobbled into the room, with her cane tapping the floor like a metronome. Her gnarled fingers clutched a pale blue baby blanket she claimed had been meant for a grandchild long since grown. Her cloudy eyes misted over as she gently draped it over the puppies, whispering, "They'll need something soft to remember this world is kind." By the flickering light of the clinic's old fireplace, the puppies finally began to stir more strongly. They were given names before the night was over. The smallest, barely larger than a teacup, was named Pip for his tiny squeaks. The loudest, who had cried out first from the cold, became Scout. And the only girl, her fur already glowing pale gold like the morning sun, was named Maple. Max, exhausted but unwilling to leave his post, stayed curled near the basket where the puppies now slept. His eyes grew heavy, but he refused to sleep until the soft sounds of the puppies' breathing settled into peaceful rhythms. And for the first time in a long while, under that quiet roof, the people of Willow Creek remembered what it felt like to believe in small miracles. Spring crept into Willow Creek, not with a grand announcement, but with a quiet surrender. The snow began to melt, reluctantly, retreating into the dark corners of alleys and under porches, while fragile shoots of green pushed bravely through the softened earth. The air still held a bite, but every once in a while, a warm breeze would slip through the town like a promise yet to be kept. For Jamie Fletcher, life had settled into a rhythm he hadn't known he needed. After school, while other boys played basketball near the rec center or gathered at the local diner, Jamie preferred the old stone bench by the bakery where Max was almost always waiting. The golden retriever had become a permanent fixture at Claire's bakery and in Jamie's life, a guardian, a confidant, and in some inexplicable way, a mirror for his own quiet struggles. Jamie was a slender boy with sharp cheekbones and a mop of unruly straw-colored hair that refused to lie flat, no matter how many times he ran his fingers through it. His gray eyes often seemed too serious for someone his age, shadowed by memories that belonged to a life harder than it should have been. He still wore the same frayed red jacket he'd brought from Denver, though the sleeves were now undeniably short at the wrists, a silent testament to how quickly life moved, even when you weren't ready for it. Max, in contrast, seemed ageless. Though his coat still bore the rough texture of a winter spent fending for himself, the golden hues gleamed brighter under the growing sun. His calm demeanor, his thoughtful eyes, and his ever-watchful posture gave him the air of a guardian spirit, and Jamie had come to rely on that unspoken loyalty more than he cared to admit. One chilly afternoon, Jamie sat with his sketchbook propped against his knees, a pencil moving carefully across the page. Max lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, his tail occasionally flicking in the cool breeze. "I'm terrible at drawing people," Jamie muttered as he shaded Max's eyes, trying to capture the depth he saw in them every day. "But you're easy." Max gave a low, contented huff, as if in agreement. "You know," Jamie continued his pencil, pausing, "it's weird. I don't think I've talked to anyone as much as I talk to you, and you don't even answer back." He smiled faintly, tracing the soft lines of Max's ears on the page. "Maybe that's why it's easier. Behind them, the door to the buttered crumb creaked open, and Claire stepped out carrying a tray with 2 mugs of hot cocoa steam curling into the chilly air. She was wearing her faded blue apron, her silver hair pinned back neatly, and a soft smile pulled at the corners of her lips. Taking artistic liberties with my favorite customer, she teased handing Jamie one of the mugs. Jamie flushed slightly, pulling the sketchbook closer, as if to protect it from scrutiny. "It's just practice," he mumbled, though his fingers lingered over the page where Max's face was beginning to come to life. Claire sat down beside him on the bench with a soft sigh, her hands curling around her own mug. "Your mother? She was an artist too, wasn't she?" Jamie's shoulders stiffened, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Yeah," he muttered. "She used to paint landscapes, said the sky was her favorite canvas because it changed every day." Claire's voice softened. "She sounds like someone who saw beauty everywhere." Jamie didn't reply right away. When he did, his voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the breeze. "I think she would have liked it here. It's peaceful, like the kind of place she always wanted but never found." Claire reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a while, letting the silence fill the spaces where words often failed. As the afternoon light began to fade, a familiar figure approached from down the street. Mrs. Ada Corbin, the town's postmaster, waddled toward them, with her arms full of wrapped parcels and letters. A stout woman, with a fondness for knitted scarves and a fierce dedication to the privacy of her patrons, Ada was known for knowing everything about everyone, and still pretending she knew nothing at all. She paused in front of the bench, eyeing the boy and the dog with a knowing smile. "I've got a delivery for you, Jamie," she said, pulling a small package from the stack. Her fingers ringed with chunky turquoise stones, handed over a plain brown parcel tied with simple string. Jamie frowned. "I wasn't expecting anything." Ada gave him a wink. "Sometimes the best things come when you're not expecting them, dear." With that, she continued on her way, her floral scarf flapping dramatically in the wind. Jamie untied the string carefully, his fingers trembling just a little. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook, the initials MF embossed on the corner in gold. There was a note tucked inside, written in a familiar looping hand, his mother's handwriting. "For when you're ready to find beauty again, remember, Jamie, the sky isn't the only thing that changes. Hearts can too. Love, Mom." Jamie swallowed hard, his vision blurring as he ran his fingers across the embossed cover. Max pressed his head gently against Jamie's leg, as if to ground him in the moment, to remind him he wasn't alone. Claire watched quietly, her heart aching and full at the same time. She rose from the bench, her voice gentle. "Come inside, boys. It's getting cold. And I think today calls for an extra helping of cinnamon rolls." Jamie stood slowly, slipping the sketchbook into his backpack like a precious secret. Max stood beside him, his tail brushing against the boy's leg, as they followed Claire into the warm light of the bakery. That evening, for the first time in what felt like forever, Jamie sat by the window of the bakery, his new sketchbook open, drawing not just Max, but the town, the sky. And without even realizing it, hope. Spring had teased Willow Creek with warm afternoons and the sweet scent of budding lilacs. But as night fell, the weather turned capricious. A restless wind howled down the empty streets, rattling shutters and stirring the brittle remnants of winter. Thunder rolled in the distance, low and menacing, as if warning the town of something more than just a passing storm. Inside the buttered crumb, the warmth of the oven still lingered. Claire had stayed late that evening, finishing a batch of cinnamon rolls for the church charity event the next morning. She worked quietly, humming an old hymn under her breath, unaware that a frayed wire hidden behind the pantry shelves was glowing hotter with each passing minute. Max lay by the door as usual, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but ears alert. The first sharp crackle of something unnatural caught his attention. He lifted his head, his dark eyes scanning the room. Another faint pop. Then the unmistakable scent hit his nose, burnt insulation mixed with smoke. By the time the thin, acrid tendrils of smoke curled from beneath the pantry door, Max was already on his feet. He barked sharply once, then again, louder and more urgent. Claire, still at the counter, kneading dough, paused and frowned. "What's gotten into you, boy?" she asked, brushing flour from her hands. Then she saw it, the thin gray fingers of smoke creeping along the baseboards. Her eyes widened. "Oh, Lord!" She gasped, her heart slamming against her ribs as panic clawed its way through her chest. Max was already at the door, barking frantically into the night. Without hesitation, he sprinted out into the dark, his powerful legs churning against the pavement as he raced down the street, his bark echoing through the narrow lanes of Willow Creek. Up on Maple Street, Jamie was in his room, sketchbook balanced across his lap, a pencil tracing lazy lines of Max's familiar silhouette. When he heard the distant barking sharp and insistent, his head snapped up. He knew that voice, and he knew it wasn't a call for attention. It was a warning. Without thinking, Jamie bolted from his chair, pulling on his jacket and sprinting out into the street. The smell of smoke hit him halfway down the block. He didn't slow his pace. By the time Jamie reached the bakery, orange light flickered through the windows and thin plumes of smoke curled into the sky. Max stood by the door, barking and pacing frantically. Claire Jamie shouted, his voice raw. "Claire, are you in there?" From inside, a faint voice answered, choked with smoke. "Jamie, I'm trying." Before Jamie could think of a plan, a figure emerged from the shadows across the street. Thomas Griggs, the town's blacksmith, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, his heavy leather apron still on from a late night at the forge, rushed toward them. His weathered face was streaked with soot, his thick arms ready to break down the door if needed. "Step back, lad," he barked, and with one powerful kick, the old wooden door gave way. Smoke billowed out thick and choking. Claire stumbled forward through the haze, her face pale and streaked with tears. Jamie caught her by the shoulders, helping her out into the clear air. But before anyone could stop him, Max dashed back inside. Max, Claire cried out, her voice breaking. Jamie moved to go after him, but Thomas grabbed his arm, shaking his head. "Too dangerous, boy. Let him do what he's gotta do." Inside the bakery, flames licked at the edges of the pantry door, and the ceiling groaned ominously above. But Max wasn't looking for a way out. He was looking for something else, something important. Through the thickening smoke, Max found it Claire's old checkered dish towel, the one she always hung by the back counter. Faded red and white, worn soft by years of use, it still smelled faintly of cinnamon and home. Max grabbed it in his jaws and turned toward the exit, his paws slipping on the smoke-slicked tiles as embers fell around him. With a final burst of strength, Max shot through the doorway just as part of the ceiling collapsed behind him. He emerged into the cool night air, the dish towel clenched between his teeth, his golden coat streaked with ash, his left paw dragging slightly. Claire fell to her knees, pulling Max close, tears streaming freely now. "You foolish, brave boy," she whispered into his fur, clutching him like a lost child found again. Jamie knelt beside them, his hand resting gently on Max's heaving side. "He went back for your towel," Jamie said softly, his throat tight. He brought it out. Claire looked at the scorched fabric and understood. Max hadn't just saved a memory. He had saved a part of her heart, a thread of her life's quiet moments, her connection to all the mornings and afternoons spent in that little bakery. The fire brigade arrived moments later, led by Captain Roy Denner, his face grim as his team worked to contain the smoldering ruin. The bakery would survive, but barely. The rear storeroom was lost, and smoke had damaged most of the interior. Yet, through it all, no lives had been lost. At dawn, Max lay quietly in the veterinary clinic, again his left paw bandaged. Dr. Martha Brenly shook her head with a fond, weary smile. "This dog," she muttered as she checked his pulse. "He's something else entirely." That morning, the people of Willow Creek didn't speak of Max as a stray or a wanderer. They spoke his name with reverence. And from that day forward, no one ever called him homeless again. Spring settled into Willow Creek with a gentle touch, as if careful not to disturb the quiet resilience of its people. The air smelled of wet earth and blooming dogwoods, and the streets echoed with the soft sounds of hammers and saws as neighbors worked side by side to restore what had been lost. The buttered crumb stood at the center of it all, its charred beams now replaced with fresh-cut timber from the local mill, and the scent of new beginnings mingling with the faint traces of cinnamon that refused to leave the old stone foundation. The bakery had always been a landmark, but now it became a symbol of something more: community hope and the kindness that rose from ashes. Claire stood outside her bakery one bright afternoon, her weathered hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the work. She wore a faded floral dress under her thick apron, her silver hair pinned back neatly as always, though a few rebellious strands danced in the breeze. Lines etched deep around her mouth, and eyes told the story of years lived hard and soft alike. But today, those eyes held a rare sparkle. Max sat faithfully by her side, his paw still wrapped in a light bandage but healing well. His golden coat had regained its shine under the loving care of the townspeople, and his posture held the quiet pride of a soldier returning home. Beside him tumbled a small bundle of energy and fluff, Maple the only remaining puppy of the rescued litter. Maple was a whirlwind of life. Her coat shimmered in soft gold, her ears too big for her tiny head, flopping comically with every bounding step. Her tail was a constant metronome of joy, wagging even in her sleep. Her pale blue eyes held the same unshakable optimism that Max carried, but where he was calm and deliberate, Maple was a burst of sunlight and mischief, darting through the grass and tumbling over her own oversized paws. As Claire watched them, a familiar voice called out, "Looks like you've got your hands full." Jamie Fletcher approached his school bag slung carelessly over one shoulder, his face flushed from the jog over. He had grown taller in the past few months, his lanky frame beginning to show the early signs of a young man finding his strength. His unruly straw-colored hair remained as wild as ever, and his gray eyes seemed lighter these days, as though carrying less weight. Claire smiled warmly. "And how's my favorite artist today?" Jamie lifted the corner of his sketchbook. Inspired, he said, his eyes drifting to Max and Maple. "They make it easy." Claire reached into the pocket of her apron and handed him a folded piece of parchment. "Well, how would you like to make that inspiration useful? I need an extra pair of hands in the afternoons. Pays not much, but the cinnamon rolls are free." Jamie's eyes lit up with something brighter than just excitement. "Really?" "You sure?" Claire gave him a knowing look. "You've been practically living here anyway. Might as well make it official." From that day forward, Jamie became a fixture at the Buttered Crumb. After school, he would trade his sketchbook for an apron, helping stock shelves knead dough and sweep the flour-dusted floors. Max followed him everywhere, a silent guardian, while Maple insisted on turning every stray bag of flour into her personal playground. The townspeople adored the sight of them. Mrs. Agnes Henley, who had once rarely left her window seat, now made a point to visit the bakery each morning, wrapped in her lavender shawl and carrying a basket of fresh herbs for Claire. She often sat on the bench outside, offering Maple tiny bits of dried lamb, while regaling anyone who would listen with stories of Willow Creek's golden years. Even Patrick Fletcher, Jamie's father, found himself stopping by more often. His face once hardened by loss, and long hours at the mill began to soften. He would linger by the counter sipping coffee and watching his son work alongside Claire with quiet pride. As for the other two puppies, Scout and Pip had found loving homes. Scout had gone to the Holloway family, a boisterous household with 3 young boys who adored the playful pup. Pip found a quieter home with Miss Edith Palmer, a retired schoolteacher known for her garden and her gentle spirit. Pip spent his days napping beneath blooming rose bushes and his evenings curled up by the fireplace content in his quiet paradise. But Maple stayed with Claire and Max. Every morning, as the sun stretched over Willow Creek, Max would lead Maple on slow, dignified walks through the town square. Claire would often watch from the bakery window, a cup of tea warming her hands as she smiled at the sight of them. Max with his measured steps, Maple bounding ahead and circling back like a child who couldn't bear to stray too far from home. At night, the 3 of them, Claire, Max, and Maple, would sit by the hearth. Maple, now slightly bigger but no less excitable, would rest her head on Max's side, her little chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. Max, ever the watchful protector, kept his head raised until Claire dimmed the lights and whispered, "It's time to rest, old boy." In those quiet moments surrounded by warmth and the soft crackle of the fire, Claire realized she hadn't just rebuilt her bakery. She had rebuilt her heart. Spring arrived in full splendor, painting Willow Creek with strokes of color that seemed too vivid for the memory of such a harsh winter. Dogwoods bloomed along the winding lanes, their petals drifting like pale confetti on the breeze. For the townsfolk, this year's spring festival held more meaning than ever before. It wasn't just the season they were celebrating, it was survival, kindness, and the quiet hero who had united them all. Preparations began early. Bunting in soft shades of blue and gold fluttered from every lamppost, the colors chosen to match the gentle hues of Max's coat and the bright spirit of Maple. Children practiced songs in the town square, their high voices lilting over the sound of hammers as a stage was built near the old crossroads, the very place where it had all begun. Claire stood at the edge of the square, wearing her finest floral dress and a soft shawl embroidered long ago by her mother. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the ribbon on the small wreath of dogwood blossoms she would later lay at the base of the new statue. Max sat faithfully by her side, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. His gait was slower now, but his eyes held the same steady calm that had seen them all through the darkest days. Beside him, Maple bounced with boundless energy, her tail wagging a mile a minute as she attempted to chase every falling petal. She had grown into a beautiful young dog, her golden fur catching the sunlight, and her pale blue eyes full of curiosity and joy. Jamie stood on the makeshift stage, nervously clutching the pages of his essay. He wore a crisp white shirt sleeves, rolled just slightly, and his unruly hair was for once tamed under the careful work of Claire's old hairbrush. His gray eyes scanned the growing crowd, pausing briefly on his father, Patrick, who stood near the back, hands in his pockets, a rare and proud smile tugging at the corners of his usually reserved face. Captain Roy Denner, now fully retired, but still wearing his old station jacket with pride, took the podium first. His deep voice echoed across the square as he recounted the story of that cold winter, the storm and the bravery of a golden retriever who had refused to turn away from those in need. His words were met with murmurs of agreement and misty eyes from the gathered townsfolk. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. With a flourish, Captain Denner pulled back the velvet covering from the statue. There, cast in bronze, stood the proud figure of Max. One paw slightly raised his head, tilted toward the horizon, eyes forever fixed on the unseen lives he'd once fought to save. At his feet, smaller figures curled against him, 3 tiny bronze puppies, their forms captured in perfect peaceful repose. The crowd fell silent. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, tears slipping freely down her cheeks. Max, sitting just below his own likeness, seemed to recognize something profound in the air. He lifted his head, his tail sweeping slowly across the stone at his side. Jamie stepped forward, then his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. He unfolded the papers and began to read the essay that had earned him a scholarship to the state's art academy, a piece inspired entirely by Max. He didn't wear a cape. Jamie began, his eyes lifting from the page to meet the faces in the crowd, and he never asked for thanks. But in the darkest days when hope felt like nothing more than a distant memory, Max reminded us that bravery doesn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a warm body beside you when the cold creeps in a watchful eye through sleepless nights, and a heart that never stops loving, even when the world hasn't always been kind. As Jamie's words filled the square, a hush settled over the people of Willow Creek. Claire wept openly now, her hands clasped tightly before her. Patrick Fletcher, standing near the back, cleared his throat and wiped at his eyes, though he made no move to hide the tears. Jamie continued, his voice growing stronger. Max taught me that the greatest heroes aren't the ones who stand in the spotlight. They're the ones who walk beside us in our loneliest moments, who remind us that no matter how broken we feel, we are never truly alone. When he finished, there was a long, still pause before the crowd erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, clapping with all the love and gratitude their hearts could muster. The sound echoed across the town square, rising into the warm spring air like a hymn. Max, dignified, as ever, stood slowly, his tail sweeping wide as if acknowledging the honor. Claire knelt beside him, her voice soft through her tears. "You did good, old boy. You did more than anyone ever could." As the sun set behind the hills, the square slowly emptied, but the buttered crumb remained full of laughter, the smell of fresh bread, and the low hum of contentment. Claire moved easily through the kitchen, rolling dough and humming quietly. Jamie sat by the window, his new sketchbook balanced on his lap pencil, moving swiftly as he captured the peace of the moment. On the wide wooden porch, Max and Maple lay stretched out in the last golden rays of sunlight. Maple's head rested on Max's side, her ears twitching gently in her dreams. Max, his eyes half closed, let out a contented sigh. For the first time in a long while, there was no fear of cold, no fear of hunger, and no fear of being forgotten. Here in the heart of Willow Creek, they were home, and always would be. Miracles often come quietly in a dog's loyalty, a neighbor's kindness, or the courage to love again. Max showed that even simple faithfulness can change lives. Maybe that's how God works too, through small acts of love and compassion that remind us we're never alone. If this touched your heart, share it, leave a comment about your own quiet blessings, and type Amen if you believe in everyday miracles. Subscribe for more stories of love and hope. May God bless you and those by your side.